In 1978, a Soviet state factory shipped a tiny four-wheel drive truck to Western Europe. It cost a fraction of a Range Rover, and within 4 years, it had finished ahead of one driven by a Formula One world champion at the hardest race on Earth. Land Rover had been building serious off-roaders since the 1940s. Mercedes had a full factory racing budget. The Soviets had a state-run factory that had been investigated for corruption the same week this truck got greenlit. This is the Lada Niva. And this is how the cheapest, serious 4x4 ever mass-produced humiliated some of the biggest names in off-roading, using parts pulled straight from a spare bin. The Niva exists because of an accident in bureaucracy. In the summer of 1970, Alexei Kosygin, the Soviet Union's premier and one of the most powerful economic planners in the entire country, traveled to the massive AvtoVAZ factory in Tolyatti, specifically to investigate millions of missing rubles. While he was there auditing the books, factory designers pulled him aside with a completely unrelated pitch. The Soviet countryside desperately needed a vehicle that could actually reach rural farmers and officials, since the standard sedans of the era were useless the moment the pavement disappeared. Kosygin listened and handed both AvtoVAZ and a rival manufacturer, AZLK, a formal assignment from the highest levels of Soviet government. Build something that could serve both soldiers and peasants, tough enough to be towed out of mud by a horse or pushed by hand when a horse wasn't available either. AvtoVAZ assigned the project to a team led by engineer Vladimir Solovyev, putting two competing state factories racing each other toward the same brief, itself a rarity inside a planned economy. AvtoVAZ won the assignment outright, beating AZLK's rival proposal. Their first attempt was almost comically crude, a roofless, doorless prototype nicknamed the Crocodile. Cobbled together from spare parts, already sitting in the factory's bins, leaning heavily on AvtoVAZ's long technical relationship with Italy's Fiat. It was rejected immediately as too rough even for rural service work. By 1973, a second attempt emerged with doors and a proper hardtop added, and the design team themselves described their own creation in a phrase that's followed the truck for 50 years: a Renault, 5-body on a Land Rover, 4WD chassis. The project then suffered a genuine personal tragedy. Solovyev, the original lead designer, died in 1975 midway through development, and leadership passed to a young engineer named Pyotr Prusov. Born in a small Belarusian village in 1942, trained at the Zaporozhye Machine Building Institute, and only recently arrived at the Togliatti factory in 1970 as an entry-level design engineer. Prusov took final credit for shepherding the Niva to production, a role he'd carry for the rest of his career. He stayed at AvtoVAZ for decades afterward, eventually rising to chief engineer of the entire company before passing away himself in 2017 at age 75. Having spent essentially his entire working life tied to the truck he inherited mid-crisis from a man he never got the chance to properly replace. A team led by engineer Vadim Kotlyarov spent years torture testing the surviving prototypes across the most punishing terrain the Soviet Union had to offer: the Ural Mountains, the deserts of the Kazakh SSR, the Pamir Mountains along the Tajik border, running it directly against the military's own UAZ-469, and remarkably against smuggled-in Western rivals. British Land Rover series trucks and early Range Rovers, brought in specifically for comparison testing behind the Iron Curtain. During the 1973 and 1974 trials specifically, documented test results showed the prototype climbing a 58% grade and fording 24 inches of water and 39 inches of mud and snow. Numbers the team recorded precisely, knowing exactly what kind of comparison they were eventually going to face. Series production began on April 5, 1977, with the truck named after the Russian word for crop field, a name chosen deliberately to remind everyone exactly who it was built for. Here's what made the Niva genuinely radical rather than just cheap. It was one of the very first mass-produced off-roaders on Earth built around a unibody structure instead of the heavy body-on-frame construction every serious 4x4 used at the time. the Jeep CJ, the Land Rover series, the Toyota Land Cruiser. All of them bolted a separate body onto a traditional ladder frame, a formula considered completely non-negotiable for genuine off-road durability. Autovaz's engineers rejected that assumption outright, fusing the Niva's body and chassis into a single rigid structure, measuring just 3,740 millimeters long on a 2,200 millimeter wheelbase, weighing barely 1,150 kilograms, remarkably light for a genuine four-wheel drive vehicle of its era. They loaded that compact package with mechanicals that punched far above its price tag. Full-time four-wheel drive, a genuine low-range transfer case, and, remarkably, for a vehicle this cheap, a locking center differential, splitting power 50-50 between the axles whenever the driver needed maximum traction. Early prototypes reportedly tested a transfer case offering as many as 5 distinct operating modes, including front-only, rear-only, and full-time four-wheel drive with low range reduction, before the simplified production version settled on the 3-lever layout that became the Niva's signature. One for the standard gearbox, one for the differential lock, one for selecting high or low range. Independent front suspension, paired with a live rear axle, gave the Niva roughly 265 millimeters of ground clearance, riding on narrow 175/80-R16 wheels, wrapped in domestically designed Voltier 5 off-road tires specifically engineered to maximize ground pressure and resist bogging down in mud or snow. That suspension layout was itself unusual for the era. Combining independent geometry up front with a traditional live axle out back gave the Niva a useful middle ground between on-road manners and true wheel articulation, a compromise most rivals at the time didn't bother attempting in either direction. The 1.6-liter engine, pulled straight from Autovaz's existing sedan lineup, produced a modest 75 horsepower, a figure that looked unimpressive next to a contemporary Land Rover, right up until you accounted for how little the lightweight unibody Niva actually weighed by comparison. Less mass to move meant the modest engine simply didn't have to work as hard. The same basic physics that would let other lightweight off-roaders punch above their spec sheets for decades afterward. Once the Niva proved itself domestically, Autovaz did something genuinely unusual for a state-run Soviet enterprise during the height of the Cold War. It went hunting for hard currency, exporting the truck aggressively into markets most Soviet products never touched. The Niva debuted internationally at the 1978 Paris Motor Show, and within a single year had captured roughly 40% of Europe's entire four-wheel drive market, a staggering number for a vehicle built behind the Iron Curtain, competing directly against Land Rover and Range Rover on their own continent. It became the only Soviet car ever regularly sold in Japan. British buyers knew it as the Lada Cossack, later renamed the Hussar. Austrian and Icelandic markets sold it as the Lada Taiga and Lada Sport respectively, while Uruguayan import paperwork, somewhat bizarrely, registered it as the Bogner Diva. Decades later, when General Motors partnered with Autovaz, an updated version emerged as the Chevrolet Niva, sold across multiple continents under an entirely different corporate parent. Domestic Soviet buyers, ironically, often waited longer than Western Europeans, since hard currency export sales took priority over the rural citizens the truck had originally been designed to serve. The Expedition record is where the Niva genuinely stopped being a quirky budget off-roader and started becoming something closer to a piece of exploration equipment. A Niva joined the Soviet Antarctic expedition, covering more than 40,000 kilometers between 1990 and 2001, while operating in temperatures as low as -54 degrees Celsius. In 1998, a modified lengthened VAZ-2131 Niva was actually dropped by parachute onto the polar ice cap, then successfully drove its assigned route at the North Pole, becoming the first wheeled vehicle ever recorded spending time there. That same year, a Niva climbed to a 5,200-meter base camp on Mount Everest. The following year, on September 16, 1999, a Niva belonging to a St. Petersburg expedition team pushed even further, reaching 5,725 meters on a Tibetan mountain. At the time, the highest altitude any motorized vehicle had ever recorded reaching on Earth. Police departments, ambulance services, fire crews, and snowplow operators across the Soviet Union all adopted the platform domestically as well. The truck has since worn more names than almost any vehicle in automotive history: Cossack, Hussar, Taiga, Sport, Bushman, Fora, Job. Yet the mechanical formula underneath barely changed across all of them. The Niva's single most embarrassing run against the established off-road industry came at the Paris-Dakar Rally, a roughly 6,000-mile multi-week crossing of the Sahara that destroyed purpose-built racing trucks regularly, let alone modestly modified production vehicles. A French importer named Jean-Jacques Poche ran the effort almost single-handedly, fielding factory-backed Nivas under the now legendary Porsche livery, starting with the very first attempt in 1980, which retired without finishing. The team came back stronger the following year. In 1981, near-standard Nivas, driven by Frenchmen Jean-Claude Briavoine and André Trossat, finished the brutal event in the 3rd and 11th place, respectively, beating dedicated racing buggies and factory Range Rover 5.8 EIS, entered by serious, well-funded teams. Skeptics called it a fluke. The POC team returned in 1982, fielding 4 cars, and Briavoine finished 2nd place overall, directly ahead of a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagen piloted by Jackie Ickx, a genuine Formula One veteran with 25 podium finishes and 4 outright wins at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, one of the most accomplished drivers alive at that moment. The Niva that achieved it wasn't entirely stock, and the team had swapped in a 2.5-liter Chrysler engine for the desert heat. But the chassis, suspension, and 4-wheel drive architecture underneath remained the exact same system Soviet farmers were driving to market that same year. The team kept coming back. By 1984, the POC operation had grown enough cultural weight that it attracted genuine celebrity entries. French Formula One driver Jean-Pierre Jabouille and popular French singer Michel Sardou co-drove a Niva that year under sponsor livery. In 1986, a POC Niva, driven by Pierre Lartigue and Bernard Giroux, finished an extraordinary 4th place overall, beaten only by 2 factory Porsche 959s, and finishing ahead of multiple Mitsubishi and Range Rover entries with vastly larger budgets behind them. A budget Soviet hatchback run by one French importer with a shoestring operation and no original automotive design pedigree behind it had repeatedly outfinished some of racing's most decorated living champions on the hardest stage in motorsport. Mercedes' own factory team didn't take the outright Dakar win until 1983. A full year after a near stock, Lada had already beaten one of their factory cars to the finish line. Even sanctions couldn't stop the Niva from being built. They just made it cruder. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western sanctions cut off AvtoVAZ's access to imported components almost overnight, including Bosch-supplied ABS brake systems, satellite-based accident alert systems, and even basic radio head units. Rather than halt production entirely, the factory simply stripped the truck back down. The resulting Classic 22 edition removed anti-lock brakes and airbags outright, launching at roughly $13,600 in a limited run of 1,800 units. A vehicle genuinely less safety-equipped in 2022 than the original 1977 model had aimed to eventually become. Renault, which had held a controlling stake in AvtoVAZ since 2008, sold its entire stake for a symbolic €1 and exited the country entirely following the invasion, ending a partnership that had once been credited with saving the company from collapse. AvtoVAZ pressed on alone, restoring ABS and basic safety equipment by 2024, while updating the engine to meet Euro 5 emissions standards. A genuine technical achievement for a company suddenly cut off from most of its previous Western supply chain. The Niva's mechanical simplicity, the same trait that helped Soviet farmers fix it in a field with basic tools decades earlier, has made it disturbingly visible inside the war itself, with documented footage showing Russian soldiers using stock civilian Nivas for transport during assault operations in Ukraine. The truck, never designed for combat, simply being too cheap, too available, and too mechanically simple to leave sitting in a driveway. A genuinely new Niva replacement, internally patented under Russian registration, remains in slow development, reportedly not expected to enter production before 2028, while a separate, unrelated SUV called the Lada Azimut, the brand's first all-new SUV in nearly 3 decades, is set to launch in 2026 instead, built on domestic technology specifically to avoid the exact international supply chain that sanctions had just severed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and AvtoVAZ very nearly collapsed alongside it, scraping through the chaotic 1990s on dwindling state support, and a customer base suddenly navigating a market economy nobody at the factory had been trained for. The platform proved flexible enough to spawn its own strange offshoot during that same desperate decade. In 1993, a spin-off company called PSA Bronto began building specialized armored and all-terrain variants directly on the Niva's underlying chassis, including the Marsh 1, a swamp buggy riding on oversized balloon tires that became a genuine sensation at a Moscow auto show in 1995, and the later Marsh 2, an 8-passenger emergency vehicle whose rear seats folded flat to transport injured patients. PSA Bronto also built camouflaged armored Niva variants for the Russian military under the Lynx designation before the company was absorbed by a rival firm in 2012 and formally dissolved in 2015. A strange, militarized footnote built entirely on the bones of a truck originally designed for farmers. Through every one of those upheavals, the Niva itself simply never stopped being built. After the original Land Rover and its eventual successor, the Defender, both went out of production in 2016, the Niva quietly inherited a remarkable title, the longest continuously produced off-road vehicle still manufactured in its original form anywhere on Earth. By the end of 2020, an estimated 650,000 Nivas had been sold globally, with combined sales across every Niva-related variant estimated north of 2.5 million units. A dedicated Swiss-based enthusiast group, the Niva Red Legend Team, still campaigns a 1984 model Niva in the modern Dakar's classics category today, racing a roughly 3,730-mile route under strict rules requiring the powertrain remain genuinely stock, the same basic formula still proving itself decades later. It is, by any honest measure, slow, basic, occasionally rust-prone, and was awarded a genuinely dismal 0 out of 4 stars in Russia's own crash safety testing in 2002. Testers specifically noted the glove compartment alone posed a serious head injury risk in a frontal impact. Nobody seriously argues the Niva is refined or even particularly safe by modern standards. And yet it has outlasted nearly every Western rival it was originally built to imitate. Land Rover, the truck the Niva's own designers explicitly copied, chased size, luxury, and complexity for decades until the modern Defender became a 6-figure lifestyle product with a dashboard screen larger than some televisions. Toyota's Land Cruiser followed a similar path into premium territory most owners never take off pavement. The Niva did the opposite. It stayed cheap, stayed mechanical, stayed almost embarrassingly simple, and kept rolling off the same factory line in Togliatti, run by a company that, by most rational business logic, should have stopped existing multiple times over. A corruption investigation accidentally produced one of the most quietly significant off-roaders ever built. A budget Soviet hatchback beat a Formula One legend, driving a Mercedes-Benz on the hardest race on Earth, then went on to reach the North Pole and the slopes of Everest. 50 years later, it's still in production, and still embarrassing companies that spent infinitely more money trying to build something more complicated. If you've ever driven, owned, or fixed a Niva with nothing but a wrench and a prayer, tell us in the comments, and subscribe.